Claudia Chender is leader of the NDP here in Nova Scotia and joins me for a conversation. Claudia Chender, thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. Nice to talk.
Nice to talk indeed. Okay, I do want to ask you about the story, the reason why we reached out. Opposition politicians unite in calling for laws to limit use of non-disclosure agreements, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you your take on what happened in Truro yesterday with the Mass Casualty Commission's final report. No, nothing specific, but I guess just your broad reaction, if you will, please.
Sure. Thanks for asking. I was really honored to be in that room, Todd. I mean, it was a very emotional day, and of course, along with everyone else, I was thinking of the families and the impact on the families and the community and all of those impacted by that report. And I found it very moving. You know, we, in the aftermath of the events of April 2020, pushed hard for a full commission. And so we were glad to see the commission impaneled, and I was glad to hear the results. It's a very long report, as you know. But, you know, in the amount of it that I've been able to digest so far, I think the calls for a transformational approach to public safety and policing, the notion that community groups and organizations, particularly those combating gender-based violence, should actually be equal partners and equally funded, you know, to our police forces is something that really many of us engaging with and working around the sector have known for a long time. So it was really good to see it in print, and now we need to see it in action.
Okay, so as to that, as a member of the opposition, it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to see that something happens here. But what do you think your role might be, and your counterparts your Liberal counterparts when it comes to making sure that some of this stuff gets implemented on the provincial level at least?
Well, you know, a lot of it are things that we have been pushing for a long time. So we've been calling for a public, community-led review of policing in Nova Scotia for years. You know, similarly, kind of raising the funding and profile and partnership with frontline community organizations. So, you know, I think we stand ready to work with the government to implement the findings. And where the government doesn't act to implement those findings, you know, and we determine that this is something that would make a big difference. You know, the commission spent a lot of time coming up with this. Then we will continue to push for that implementation to happen. You know, I think one of the most moving things that I heard from the commissioners yesterday, which was echoed by some other folks I spoke to, including political representatives from the area, was, you know, if nothing else, change, the transformational change that report called for, can be something good that comes out of this tragedy. And I think we all need, number one, for nothing like this to ever happen again, and number two, to take the opportunity presented by this awful tragedy and, you know, make sure that we create a legacy that has something positive attached to it. And so we'll work to do that.
Would you potentially support kind of a provincial police force as opposed to the RCMP in throughout these rural kind of municipalities and part of HRM for that matter?
Well, you know, the Premier was asked about that today, and he said everything's on the table, and that's the answer we want to hear. I think we're not in a position, I'm not really in a position to say yes or no to that until we have that comprehensive review. We hear about the challenges from municipalities in funding the RCMP. We hear from the Commission about the real gaps in the RCMP service and in the communication between the RCMP and municipal forces. So certainly I think we need a fulsome review. And at that point, I think it'll be time to talk about, you know, what the kind of transformational approach actually looks like.
Might there be something by way of presenting bills or in the legislature that might keep this on the forefront, keep this going?
Yeah, there might. I mean, the report came out yesterday. Some folks got it the day before. As I mentioned, it's 3,000 pages. So I definitely think that the government, all levels of government, need a little bit of time to absorb this and understand how they can act on it. But certainly when we come back in the fall, if we haven't seen real strides being made to turn some of those recommendations into action, that will be the time when, we can consider legislative tools. Because when I spoke to folks in the room yesterday, particularly the many women's organizations who took the time to work with the commission and present, they were glad to see their words on the page. But all of them said what really matters here is action. And so we'll be looking for that action. And like I say, people need a little bit of time. We acknowledge that. But we'll see where we are in the fall.
And again, I don't want to be repetitive here, and I think you've covered it well. But we know that healthcare is such a focus now that it's kind of taken, and perhaps this is a broader look at other issues that are not getting the attention they should. So how does government address something as big as healthcare and then take on something as massive like this as well? It's difficult, I guess, is what I'm suggesting or asking. What do you think?
Well, I suppose, but I have to say that I'm concerned increasingly that the focus on, healthcare is becoming a shield against doing things in other areas. So, I think a huge part of this report talked about the epidemic of gender-based and intimate partner violence in our province and in the country. That is healthcare. Safety is healthcare. If women can't remain safe, and I know we were going to talk about NDAs, and I think
we're going to
connected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? This is all connected, right?
Yeah.
Like if women aren't safe, they're certainly not healthy. So, absolutely, there's a focus on healthcare, but healthcare is food security, healthcare is housing, and healthcare is safety. So I think we need to broaden the conversation about, what does it mean to be healthy in this province?
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that. I'll read a bit from this referencing a recent CBC story. It says the divide between the PC and opposition MLAs in the Nova Scotia legislature was starkly evident as Liberal and NDP politicians, as well as the only independent, it should be mentioned, of course, as well, Elizabeth Smith-McCrossin, urged the Houston government to support bills intended to restrict the use of non-disclosure agreements. And you introduced a bill, 144, which would recently or last year outlaw non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual harassment or discrimination. However, the Houston government doesn't look as though that they're going to move on this anytime soon, right?
That's right. We did ask. We introduced the bill, in fact, last year. We have been pressing the government on it this year. This session, we have had no commitment. And we pressed the Minister of Justice again yesterday in estimates on it, and he would categorically not give a commitment, nor would he answer my question about whether or not there had been engagement. So, the response we're getting is that they're doing a never-ending jurisdictional scan. So they're looking at what other provinces and jurisdictions are doing, and it's worth pointing out that Prince Edward Island has passed almost identical legislation to the one that we put forward, which doesn't ban non-disclosure agreements, but bans the misuse of them. So you can't pay someone to sign something around a wrong that has been done to them, particularly if we're talking about cases of, sexual impropriety or other abuse. Those would not be valid. And so the value in that is that we wouldn't have these kind of terrible sort of serial abuse, which we've seen, all over North America. We saw most famously with Harvey Weinstein. There was a scandal at Fox, and most recently here in Canada with Hockey Canada.
Yeah.
When those kind of crimes are covered up, then they happen again and again and again. And so it's stopping the cover-up of those crimes. As far as we can tell, the Department of Justice, in their years-long now jurisdictional review, haven't talked to, again, these frontline organizations who really understand the reality of this. And there is a campaign, Can't Buy My Silence, which has been at the forefront of pushing for this. 94% of lawyers who in the Canadian Bar Association have signaled their support for ending this misuse of non-disclosure agreements, which is a huge statistic because the legal community have often been cited as the barrier to taking this action. So we're quite disappointed that government has chosen not to act here, and we will absolutely keep pushing for it because a cautious approach is not what's called for here because, the longer we wait, the more we know that it's still happening. And that has a terrible impact, I would argue on our province and certainly on people's lives.
Yeah, and I don't really see the win on foot dragging on this. I don't
Nope.
see it at all, to be honest with you. And the fact that the Justice Minister kind of downplayed it as we've got more important things to deal with right now. That's a slap in the face, really, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
And I think, again, we're dealing with issues that, predominantly impact women, although not exclusively, and more vulnerable people. And I think it's a real insult, and I think it's a real indictment of this government's sort of inability to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, fix healthcare, but safety is healthcare. And, the Minister of Justice said to me yesterday, well, we're moving quick. The Premier wants to move quickly on healthcare, but I'm a guy who moves slowly. Yeah. And, that's just not acceptable from my perspective. There are, of course, a lot of wealthy and powerful people who are party to these kinds of agreements who will surely be lobbying for the status quo, who will not want these changed. But, we are calling on this government to step up and do the right thing. It's not just Prince Edward Island who's passed this legislation. 17 U.S. states. There's legislation at the federal level in the U.S. Ireland's passed legislation. It's an idea whose time has long since come. And, every day that we wait is a day that people are potentially harmed. So, we certainly won't take our foot off the gas on this. And we hope that the government has a change of heart before the end of this session.
All right. So if it doesn't happen before the end of the session, then what? I guess, do you have to introduce a new bill, or how would they could come forward with their own? I'm sure you'd be happy to support their own a PC bill on this, right?
We would absolutely support a PC bill on this. Yeah. In our legislature, the bill will stay on the order paper, so to speak, so it will still be able to be passed until the legislature is prorogued. So we don't know when that will happen. So if we need to bring new legislation, we will, or we'll continue to debate the legislation we've introduced.
Okay. Thank you, Claudia. I appreciate your time as always.
Thanks so much, Todd.
All right. Take care. Claudia Chender, leader of the NDP. Sports at Cecil when we come back.